When the battle began between the Saturn and PlayStation in late 1994, it was Virtua Fighter and Battle Arena Toshinden that were on the front lines. Sega's Fighter was a flat-shaded polygon port of the arcade original, while Toshinden was a brand new textured mapped creation just for the PlayStation. Gameplay aside, it was a terrible showing for Sega in terms of immediate visual appeal. The pictures gamers were first exposed to in gaming magazines showed a very plain-looking set of flat-shaded fighters against a set of beautiful textured mapped fighters. It was an early comparison that made the PlayStation look radically more powerful than Saturn, adding to the already growing consensus that Sony simply had the better technology. After the two machines launched in North America, Toshinden sold extremely well, helping to propel the PlayStation past Saturn literally overnight. This was a nasty reality for Sega because it had launched its Saturn in the US roughly 4 months prior. Since Toshinden was a third-party property handled by Takara, Sega wanted a version to call their own. Nearly a year after the PlayStation version first showed up in Japan, Battle Arena Toshinden S would be launched on the Sega Saturn. It was developed by Nextech and published by Sega, a port that added quite a bit of extra story and a few extra fighters. The thing is, the port was rather weak compared to the original in terms of visuals. The texture work wasn't as smooth, transparencies were lost, and the backgrounds were entirely two-dimensional. It just didn't have the same visual pizzazz, and once again, the Saturn came away looking like inferior technology. Nextech and Sega weren't done because they would then work together to port Battle Arena Toshinden Ultimate Revenge Attack to the Saturn, a loose adaptation of Toshinden 2 that originally appeared on the PlayStation. Yet again, the Saturn comes away with major concessions in the fighters and backgrounds, a clearly inferior product to the game on which it was based. You would think that that would end the great Toshinden experiments on the Saturn, and yet there was more to come. In May of 1997, Nextech and Takara threw their hats into the Saturn fighting ring one more time with D-Xhird, another weapons fighter very much in the same vein as the Toshinden games before it. Was the third time the charm for these guys? Let's find out. I'd love to start us off with a complete explanation of the story, but I have no clue what the heck is happening here. It was only released in Japan, and the translation from the manual is going on about one of the fighters having a demon inside of him, and some of the characters either out to kill him or trying to help him. The roster of fighters are your typical sword-wielding guys, young Japanese girls, an old dude, and one guy that looks a bit androgynous. You get 10 fighters to choose from initially, with an additional 4 bosses as unlockables, one of which is Eiji from Toshinden. This is very clearly inspired by that game in pretty much every aspect. It's a weapons-based fighter that uses a dodge mechanic and even mimics the piss-poor animation from Toshinden. To make things different, some of the stages feature caged arenas, which adds a fighting vipers-like twist to the gameplay. Each fighter can use the cage to their advantage with additional damage during combos and knockdowns. Open arenas also have a new fall recovery that can be performed if you begin to fall out the ring. Press up and you can jump away from that fall and position yourself for a better attack. There's a bar under your life that governs your super moves, which is usually some form of high damage combo or projectile attack. The button layout is inspired by Toshinden as well. There are your weak and strong weapon attacks, as well as your weak and strong kick attacks. L and R are your strafe moves to avoid damage, and the final 2 buttons act as your block. Block can also be used by pressing back, but this can be turned on and off in the options. And speaking of options, despite this being a Japanese-only release, the options menu is completely in English. You'll find the story mode, versus mode, time attack, practice mode, and the main options to change difficulty, number of rounds, and the timer. This menu is also the place where you open up additional modes as you beat the game with various characters. Real Fight mode is a one-hit sudden death 2-player option, and Unlimited mode is a timer-free matchup where you can use your super attacks with no limit. To unlock these, you must defeat the bosses without continues on any difficulty.
First, battle. Go, fight!
Visually, D-Xhird is a decent-looking game with a number of standout effects. The fighters themselves are a bit thin and lacking in the detail department, but you'll notice every attack causing a light sourcing effect that is cast across both combatants. The ring and the arenas are awesome, sporting some rather impressive geometry. Whereas the previous Saturn Toshinden games had nothing but flat backdrops, D-Xhird has the addition of caged arenas. Other stages aren't cages at all, sporting a translucent fabric effect that looks incredible. There's also a giant glass arena that looks out onto floating shapes, a pool of water that runs off the sides of the stages, a giant crater with rocks flying past the ring, and a thunderstorm complete with rain and lightning. Not every stage is a standout, but there is enough here over the previous fighters done by Nextech to say that they really use the Saturn in a more impressive way, at least in the stages themselves. The real problem here is in an area that has dogged the other games in Takara's stable, the animation. Everything here is stiff, unnatural, or outright silly looking. Playing this after something like Fighters Mega Mix is like stepping down from a AAA production to a low-budget indie project. It runs at 30 frames, and I can't say I ever felt it deviate from that, so that's a small victory. I suppose I'd even go so far as to say the visuals are one of the better components of this package.
First battle. Go, fight!
The sound across the Toshinden games were always fitting and got the job done. The same can be said of the music in D-Xhird. It's got that hybrid rock feel that was popular with these games, and most of it stays in line with what you'd expect. That means if you got a kick out of Toshinden's music in past games, chances are this one will stand out as well. I've rounded up a few examples so you can decide for yourself. Coming away from D-Xhird, I couldn't help but feel that this is far from the worst fighting game on the Saturn. I mean, you set this beside the god-awful likes of Criticom or Rise 2 Resurrection, and I might even call this one good. But the more you play it, the more its glaring flaws become ever so apparent. Gameplay is extremely slow and heavy. Many of the moves are effectively useless because the basic 2 and 3 hit combos are so much faster, you get knocked out of everything that requires multiple button presses or it takes time to animate. Playing on normal and above, you'll find yourself resorting to the same 2 and 3 hit knockdown moves to stifle the AI, leading to what can only be described as an incredibly boring play session. Going through and trying different fighters confirm this again and again. Most of the special and super attacks either took too long to execute, so you got hit trying, or would just outright miss their target, leaving you utterly helpless to a retaliation attack. This manifests in a 2-player mode as well. Once you find the quickest and easiest counter combo, both opponents will revert back to that when in trouble regularly, again making for a very boring time. That becomes the narrative of this one. Boring. It's not terrible. Nothing is broken. It's just boring as hell. You get a roster of fighters that have no outstanding attributes, you get a set of moves that are mostly ineffective, the bosses you unlock don't really add anything of value, the extra modes are one and done frivolity that are easily forgotten. You have a decent looking and decent sounding fighter that just fails to have anything to hook you for the long term. This might have been forgivable had it been a launch game, or had it shown up in the first year. But this game shipped in May of 1997, 2.5 years into the Saturn's life. To put that into perspective, that means 3D fighters like Virtua Fighter 2, Fighting Vipers, and Fighters Megamix were already available, not to mention the slew of 2D fighters from third parties. That left D-Xhird in a position of looking a lot less impressive to seasoned Saturn fans that were well acquainted with the machine's awesome fighting library. It was easy to find something to play that was much better than this. Even considering the small amount of 3D fighters on Saturn, you can easily do better than D-Xhird. Don't care for the way Virtua Fighter plays? Try Last Bronx, try Dead or Alive, try Zero Divide. You're better off with any of those over this stiff, boring entry into the genre. It is important to note that among the Saturn's total fighting game library, there are much worse entries than D-Xhird. I mentioned stinkers like Criticom, but you get a whole slew of 2D entries in there as well. Your mileage with D-Xhird is likely to hinge on how you take to its gameplay. The audio-visual presentation is done well enough to not be an issue either way, but that gameplay is something else entirely. The relative slowness of most of the movesets and the clunkiness of their execution really leaves this one in a place of try before you buy. Most of the media reviews of the day were rather unkind themselves. Famitsu in Japan point-blank said there was very little fun factor here, wondering why it was released at all. Next Generation in the US didn't even appreciate the visuals, lambasting every aspect of it right down to the gameplay and its similarity to Toshinden. Most of the European magazines that tackled imports were down on it as well. Despite the poor narrative of the review, I do recommend you play this. There are some very nice VDP2 effects here that are worth seeing, and some of you may actually enjoy the music enough to play through it a couple of times. It'll be retired to your gaming shelf soon after, however, another relic of a time when game quality improved at such a rapid pace, many companies simply couldn't keep up. Nextech had 3 tries on the old Saturn and each time failed to produce a compelling product. Their partnership with Takara was a mess, and this is about as forgettable as 32-bit experiences can get. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.